Thanks very much for the opportunity to talk about this. Several years ago, Jordan, Tama, Jonathan Monton, and I decided to revive the Chicago Council on Global Affairs leader surveys in concert with our colleagues there. And those surveys from the 1980s through the early 2000s had provided scholars and policy audiences with invaluable information about elite attitudes. And we were able to revive the surveys in 2014 and take advantage of new techniques in survey design to employ an experimental methodology to see if multilateral endorsement of use of force might increase support among Americans for sending US troops. And so in this research note, we test the effects of a UN Security Council endorsement on a broad cross-section of elites, as well as on the mass public. And in this iteration of the survey, which went out in 2016, we were able to elicit responses from 484 foreign policy leaders, including members of the executive branch, congressional staff, think tanks, leading academics, as well as business, labor, religious groups, and NGOs. And alongside that, we conducted a parallel nationally representative mass public survey. And we noted that American presidents will often seek or trumpet the support of international organizations when seeking support for sending US troops. So even if American presidents decide not to pursue a resolution of support through the UN Security Council, they will often reference the support of allies or regional organizations like NATO.
And a number of previous studies have found that multilateral approval of a military operation increases domestic support for the military action. In attempting to explain this finding, scholars have advanced three main sets of explanations for why multilateral approval influences domestic support for war. And one set of arguments highlights the role of multilateral approval in providing normative legitimacy for military action. In this view, people are influenced by the decisions of international organizations, or IOs, because they perceive the decisions of IOs to be proper, correct, or sound. A second perspective highlights the role of multilateralism in spreading the costs and risks of military action. The idea here is that people are more comfortable with military interventions that have multilateral support because such support translates into greater burden sharing with other countries. A third view highlights the role of multilateral institutions in providing a signal about the wisdom of military action. According to this argument, an IO's endorsement of a military intervention provides an informative second opinion on the merits of the use of force. And while prior research has tested these competing explanations by examining public attitudes, multilateralism may be viewed differently by elites than by the public, and that's what motivated our study. On the one hand, since elites are more informed than the public about foreign policy, they might be less influenced by informational cues than the public is. On the other hand, multilateral backing might have a greater effect on elites than the public because elites are more aware of the legitimacy or burden-sharing benefits that flow from international support.
So what did we find? We found multilateral endorsement boosts support among elites across most scenarios, and that for Democratic elites and for Republican elites. And that holds true when we look exclusively at elites who had experience in the executive branch. Now, when we look at the mass public, we find that multilateral endorsement has more limited effects that are mostly among Democrats for a limited number of scenarios. So in short, we find that there are stronger effects of multilateral endorsement among elites, and that seems to have some resonance for both Democrats and Republicans.
And more broadly, our findings contribute to debates about international organizations, domestic politics, and public opinion in a few ways. First, our evidence suggests that the views of foreign policy elites may have distinct characteristics that are shaped in particular by their specialized expertise and experience. Second, our findings suggest that the differences between foreign policy elites and the public can be at least as important as partisan differences when it comes to foreign policy attitudes. There are partisan differences, but the elite public differences can be even more important. And third, although we didn't present here direct evidence on the causal mechanisms driving gaps between elite and public attitudes, the findings suggest that some mechanisms are probably more important for elites than others. In particular, since elites, especially foreign policy elites, already have a lot of knowledge about international affairs, it's more likely that their responsiveness to multilateral backing is motivated by legitimacy or burden-sharing concerns rather than by the value of getting a second opinion. And in continuing research, we're going to build on this study's findings by using new surveys to further investigate the causal mechanisms that drive differences between elites and the public, as well as within elites and within portions of the public in foreign policy attitudes, and to examine whether the effects we found here hold when the international organization providing approval is NATO rather than the UN Security Council.
Our research suggests that multilateral support for a military operation, namely from the United Nations Security Council, can help boost support among elites, including both Democrats and Republicans. That signal is less effective for the mass public. So being able to show ex ante that the United Nations or NATO allies are willing to support use of force ought to be a resource that presidents can use to build elite support for sending US troops abroad. Now, the substance of a particular case and the degree of extant partisan polarization over a particular place where US troops might be sent might ultimately shape whether or not this works in practice. So elites might find some places like sending troops to Syria unpopular no matter who endorses the mission. And other scenarios like like an attack on Israel, for example, by Iran might be subject to partisan divide. So while in theory, we might think that this multilateral endorsement ought to provide presidents with some advantage, in practice that may not always work out.
And as for the JCPOA, the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, this agreement didn't involve multilateral endorsement of military action, but rather it was a multilateral agreement on nuclear nonproliferation. And we haven't tested whether multilateral support makes elites more supportive of these kinds of agreements on nonproliferation, but that would be a possible extension of our work. That said, there might be at least 3 reasons why multilateral backing of the Iran deal didn't translate into strong bipartisan support for the agreement in the United States. First, concern about the threat of a nuclear Iran was itself already subject to a partisan split, with more Republicans than Democrats highly concerned about this threat. Second, Republican members of Congress had a strong political incentive to try to block a major foreign policy achievement that would bolster the legacy of a Democratic president, Obama in this case. And third, major interest groups with close ties to Republican members of Congress lobbied aggressively against the Iran deal. In general, we'd expect multilateral backing to be less likely to overcome partisan divides on issues where the president has a lot at stake politically, and where partisan or powerful interest groups are very active. And those expectations could be subjects of further research.